या महाराष्ट्राला भरभरून मदत केली। आज या महाराष्ट्रामध्ये या ठिकाणी प्रधानमंत्री आवास योजनेमध्ये 23 लाख लोकांना घरं दिलेत। 1,46 लाख लोकांना जलजीवन मिशनचे नळ कनेक्शन मिळाले। 3,26 लाख लोकांना आयुष्यमान भारतची योजना मिळाली, आरोग्याची योजना मिळाली। प्रधानमंत्री किसान योजनेचे 1,71 लाख लोकांना या ठिकाणी योजना मिळाली। 1,71 लाख लोकांना किसान सन्मान योजनेचा लाभ मोदींनी दिला। जीवन ज्योती विमा योजनेच्या माध्यमातून 1,34 लाख लोकांना महाराष्ट्राच्या या ठिकाणी लाभार्थ्यांना फायदा झाला। किसान क्रेडिट कार्डचा विचार केला, 87 लाख लोकांना किसान क्रेडिट कार्ड मिळालं। अटल पेन्शन योजना मोदीजींनी सुरू केली, 45 लाख लोकांना अटल पेन्शन योजनेचा लाभ झाला। स्वनिधी योजना मोदीजींनी सुरू केली, 10,47,000 लोकांना स्वनिधी योजनेचा लाभ मिळाला। प्रधानमंत्री कुसुम योजनेचा लाभ 5.5 लोकांनी घेतला, 5.5 लाख लोकांनी घेतला। आणि प्रधानमंत्री शेती विमा योजना 1,71 लाख लोकांना मिळाली। मोदीजी स्वच्छ भारत मिशनच्या माध्यमातून मोदीजींनी 77 लाख लोकांना त्या ठिकाणी स्वच्छतागृह देण्याचा प्रयत्न झाला। बंधू भगिनींनो, 6,84,00,000 लोक मोदीजीने दिलेलं फ्री अन्न आज भेटत आहे। या महाराष्ट्रामध्ये मोदीजींनी 6 कोटी लोकांना 6,84,00,000 लोकांना फ्री अन्न देण्याची योजना केली। आणि मला अभिमान आहे, या ठिकाणी काँग्रेसच्या काळामध्ये मागच्या 10 वर्षात फक्त 1 लाख कोटी मिळाले। मी सर्वांना टाळ्या वाजवून अभिनंदन मोदींचं केलं पाहिजे। महाराष्ट्राला 10 लाख कोटी रुपये, महाराष्ट्राला 10 लाख कोटी रुपये या महाराष्ट्राला देण्याचं काम मोदीजींनी केलं। आज मला अभिनंदन करायचं आहे। मोदीजींच्या आशीर्वादाने, मोदीजींच्या प्रेरणेने महाराष्ट्रामध्ये लखपती दीदी लेक लाडली, मुख्यमंत्री माझी लेक लाडली योजना सुरू झाली आणि 2,34,00,000 आमच्या बहिणींना 2,100 रुपये महिना, 25,000 रुपये वर्षांचे आता आपलं सरकार आणि मोदींच्या आशीर्वादाने मिळणार आहे। बंधू भगिनींनो, 44 लाख शेतकऱ्याचं वीज कनेक्शनचं बिल माफ झालं। या ठिकाणी आमचे देवेंद्र फडणवीसजी, एकनाथ शिंदेजींनी, मोदीजींनी सुचवलं आणि आज बघा 44 लाख शेतकऱ्यांचं बिल शून्य झालं आणि पुढचे 5 वर्ष 1ही रुपयाचं बिल शेतकऱ्याला येणार नाही। ही योजना या महाराष्ट्राच्या सरकारने केली। बंधू भगिनींनो, या ठिकाणी मला जास्त वेळ घ्यात नाही, पण मोदीजींच्या नेतृत्वामध्ये महायुती आलेली आहे, महायुती सुरू झालेली आहे, महायुतीचं सरकार आलं आहे आणि आपल्या मोदीजींच्या नेतृत्वातली भाजपाची महायुती ही महाराष्ट्राच्या विकासाची आहे, तर महाविकास आघाडी ही महाराष्ट्राचा विनाश करणारी आहे। भाजपा सोबतची महायुती महाराष्ट्राचा सन्मान करणारी आहे, तर महाविकास आघाडी महाराष्ट्राचा अवमान करणारी आहे। भाजपाची महायुती महाराष्ट्राला सत्याची दिशा देईल, तर महाविकास आघाडी असत्याची चाल देईल। भाजपाची महायुती महाराष्ट्राची प्रगती करेल, तर महाविकास आघाडी महाराष्ट्राची अधोगती करेल। भाजपाची महायुती या ठिकाणी महाराष्ट्राची आशा आहे, तर महाविकास आघाडी महाराष्ट्राची निराशा आहे। बंधू भगिनींनो, भाजपाची महायुती महाराष्ट्राची शांती आहे, तर महाविकास आघाडी अशांती आहे। भाजपाची महायुती महाराष्ट्राला न्याय देणारी आहे, तर महाराष्ट्रातली महाविकास आघाडी महाराष्ट्रावर अन्याय करणारी आहे। भाजपाची महायुती महाराष्ट्राची एकता निर्माण करत आहे, तर महाविकास आघाडी समाजामध्ये फूट पाडत आहे। भाजपाची महायुती महाराष्ट्राचा आदर आहे, तर महाविकास आघाडी महाराष्ट्राचा तिरस्कार आहे। आणि म्हणून बंधू भगिनींनो, आज मोदीजी आपल्याला ऊर्जा देण्याकरता आलेले आहे। या महाराष्ट्रामध्ये मोदीजींच्या नेतृत्वामध्ये डबल इंजिन सरकार येणार आहे आणि महाराष्ट्राला देशाचं सर्वोत्तम राज्य बनवण्याचा निर्णय महाराष्ट्राची जनता करणार है। मोदी जी, महाराष्ट्र की जनता आपके साथ है और आप जो भी हमको इस महाराष्ट्र को डबल इंजन सरकार के माध्यम से जो भी हमको देंगे, हम आपका बहुत बहुत महाराष्ट्र की ओर से आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद व्यक्त करते हुए मेरे 2 शब्द समाप्त करता हूं। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
नक्कीच साहेब, आमचा नाशिक जिल्हा आणि नाशिक शहराचे सर्व उमेदवार हे प्रचंड बहुमतांनी निवडून येतीलच असा विश्वास आपण सगळ्यांनी हात वरती करून आदरणीय पंतप्रधान आणि आदरणीय बावनकुळे साहेबांना द्यायचा आहे। आणि आता विकास की गंगा भारत के घर घर में पहुंचाने वाले आधुनिक युग के प्रधान सेवक, भारत के भाग्य विधाता, जन जन के नायक, माताएं बहनों के आधार, युवाओं के आशा स्थान, ऊर्जादायी करोड़ों लोगों के प्रेरणा स्थान, देश के गौरव, भारत माता के सपूत, विश्व नेता, तेजस्वी, सबसे यशस्वी लोकप्रिय पंतप्रधान जी माननीय श्री नरेंद्र मोदी जी, मैं आपको अनुरोध करती हूँ कि आप अपनी तेजस्वी वाणी से हमको मार्गदर्शन करें।
भारत माता की, भारत माता की, भारत माता की जय भवानी, जय भवानी। प्रभू श्री रामच्या पदस्पर्शाने पवित्र नाशिक नगरीला माझा नमस्कार। मैं भगवान त्र्यंबकेश्वर और माता रेणुका को श्रद्धापूर्वक नमन करता हूं। आज महाराष्ट्र विधानसभा चुनाव प्रचार के पहले दिन मुझे नासिक की पुण्य भूमि पर आने का सौभाग्य मिला है। जब अयोध्या में राम मंदिर की 500 साल की प्रतीक्षा पूरी हुई, जब प्रभु श्री राम एक बार फिर वापस आए, तो अयोध्या में प्राण प्रतिष्ठा से पहले 11 दिनों के मेरे व्रत अनुष्ठान की शुरुआत भी यही नासिक से शुरू हुई थी। मुझे कालाराम मंदिर में सफाई और सेवा का अवसर भी मिला था। आज एक बार फिर मैं विकसित महाराष्ट्र के लिए, विकसित भारत के लिए नासिक का आशीर्वाद लेने के लिए आया हूं। मैं देख रहा हूं नासिक में जनता जनार्दन का ये विशाल जनसमूह महाराष्ट्र का जन जन कह रहा है, भाजपा महायुती आहे तर गती आहे, महाराष्ट्राची प्रगती आहे। साथियों, आज महाराष्ट्र के प्रख्यात साहित्यकार और कला जगत के मजबूत स्तंभ रहे पू. ल. देशपांडे जी की जन्म जयंती है। मैं उनका पुण्य स्मरण करता हूं, उन्हें अपनी श्रद्धांजलि अर्पित करता हूं। साथियों, आज हमारा महाराष्ट्र विकास कर रहा है। हमारा देश नए रिकॉर्ड बना रहा है, क्योंकि आज देश में गरीबों की चिंता करने वाली सरकार है। जब गरीब आगे बढ़ता है, तभी देश आगे बढ़ता है। इतने दशकों तक देश में कांग्रेस और उसके साथियों ने गरीबी हटाओ का नारा दिया, फिर भी गरीब रोटी, कपड़ा, मकान के लिए मोहताज रहा। लेकिन अब केवल 10 वर्षों के भीतर भीतर देश के 25 करोड़ लोग गरीबी से बाहर आए हैं। ये कैसे हुआ? ये इसलिए हुआ क्योंकि मोदी की नीयत सही है। मोदी गरीब का सेवक बनकर काम करता है, आपका सेवक बनकर काम करता है। ये इसलिए हुआ क्योंकि गरीब के खिलाफ ये लड़ाई केवल मोदी ने नहीं, देश के गरीब ने भी लड़ी, आप सबने लड़ी। आज महाराष्ट्र में 50 लाख से ज्यादा महिलाओं को उज्ज्वला योजना के तहत मुफ्त गैस कनेक्शन दिए गए हैं। जल जीवन मिशन के तहत राज्य के 1.25 करोड़ से ज्यादा घरों में नल से जल ये सुविधा मिलने लगी है। आज महाराष्ट्र के लगभग 7 करोड़ जरूरतमंदों को हर महीने मुफ्त राशन मिल रहा है। राज्य के 26 लाख से ज्यादा गरीबों को पीएम आवास योजना का लाभ मिला है, उन्हें पक्के मकान दिए गए हैं। गरीबों के लिए ऐसे काम लगातार होते रहें, इसके लिए महाराष्ट्र में महायुति सरकार फिर से बननी जरूरी है। साथियों, डबल इंजन सरकार में विकास की गति डबल होती है, साथ ही योजनाओं का लाभ भी डबल हो जाता है। महाराष्ट्र के किसान आज इसका अनुभव कर रहे हैं। यहां किसानों को एक और पीएम किसान सम्मान निधि का लाभ मिल रहा है, साथ ही नमो शेतकरी महासम्मान निधि ये भी मिल रही है। यानी सालाना 12,000 रुपये की आर्थिक मदद। और मैं मेरे किसान साथियों को बताना चाहता हूं, जब महाराष्ट्र में फिर हमारी सरकार बनेगी तो ये 12,000 रुपये की मदद बढ़कर 15,000 रुपये हो जाएगी। महाराष्ट्र के लाखों किसान परिवारों को इसका बहुत बड़ा लाभ होगा। साथियों, यहां सोयाबीन, कपास, धान और दूध उत्पादकों को भी आर्थिक मदद दी गई है। पेट्रोल में इथेनॉल ब्लेंडिंग बढ़ने से गन्ना किसानों की आय में बढ़ोतरी हुई है। 10 वर्षों में करीब 80,000 करोड़ रुपए इथेनॉल की खरीद में किसानों को मिले हैं। देश का जो रुपया पेट्रोल खरीदने में विदेश चला जाता था, वो पैसा अब मेरे देश के किसानों को मिल रहा है, उनके पास जा रहा है। साथियों, मैं यहां के प्याज किसानों की भावनाएं भी समझता हूं, इसलिए प्याज के निर्यात में सहूलियत के लिए नीतियों में बदलाव किया गया है। साथियों, भारत की प्रगति के लिए महाराष्ट्र का तेजी से आगे बढ़ना बहुत जरूरी है। महाराष्ट्र आगे बढ़ेगा तभी भारत विकसित बनेगा। महाराष्ट्र किस स्पीड से आगे बढ़ सकता है, पिछले 2.5 वर्ष में महायुति सरकार ने दिखाया है। आज देश में आधुनिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर के प्रोजेक्ट्स में महाराष्ट्र बहुत आगे है। यहां हाईवेज और एक्सप्रेसवे बन रहे हैं। आधुनिक टेक्नोलॉजी से जुड़े क्षेत्रों में महाराष्ट्र में निवेश हो रहा है। लेकिन आप मुझे बताइए, अगर कोई सरकार ये काम रोक दे तो क्या महाराष्ट्र आगे बढ़ पाएगा? हाथ तो हिला रहे हो, मुंह से भी तो बोलो। क्या महाराष्ट्र आगे बढ़ पाएगा? महाराष्ट्र के युवाओं को क्या रोजगार के अवसर मिल पाएंगे? अगर ये काम रुके तो महाराष्ट्र काफी पीछे छूट जाएगा। कांग्रेस और उसके साथी यही चाहते हैं, उनका यही एजेंडा है। महाराष्ट्र में कोई भी बड़ा काम होता है, ये लोग उसका विरोध करने के लिए मैदान में आ जाते हैं। इन्होंने अटल सेतु का विरोध किया, इन्होंने वाटवन पोर्ट पर भी रोक लगाने की कोशिश की, इन्होंने मेट्रो परियोजनाओं को लटकाया। अघाड़ी वालों ने समृद्धि महामार्ग का काम ठप करने का प्रयास किया। पिछले 5 वर्षों में शुरुआती 2.5 साल महाअघाड़ी के महाभ्रष्टाचार और लटकाने अटकाने भटनाके की भेंट चढ़ गए हैं। इसलिए महाराष्ट्र के विकास की खातिर आपको अघाड़ी वालों को घुसने ही नहीं देना है, उनको सरकार से दूर रखना है। साथियों, महायुति सरकार के विकास के एजेंडे में नासिक का भी उतना ही महत्व मिल रहा है। आज आधुनिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर नासिक की तस्वीर को बदल रहा है। आज यहां जो हाईवे बन रहे हैं, ट्रांसपोर्ट के साधन तैयार हो रहे हैं, उनका बहुत बड़ा फायदा 2026 के कुंभ में भी मिलने वाला है। नासिक का आईटी पार्क बड़ी संख्या में युवाओं के लिए रोजगार के अवसर तैयार करेगा। साथियों, आज हमारा नासिक डिफेंस सेक्टर में भारत की आत्मनिर्भरता का बहुत बड़ा केंद्र भी बन रहा है। नासिक में लड़ाकू विमान और सुरक्षा उपकरण नासिक में बनाए जा रहे हैं। आज नासिक के हर व्यक्ति को इस बात का गर्व भी है कि उनका ये नासिक, उनका ये शहर सशक्त भारत में इतनी अहम भूमिका निभा रहा है। लेकिन साथियों, दूसरी तरफ एक कांग्रेस और अघाड़ी वाले लोग भी है। ये देश को पीछे करने का, देश को कमजोर करने का कोई मौका नहीं छोड़ते। इन लोगों ने डिफेंस मैन्युफैक्चरिंग में देश को पीछे करने के लिए क्या कुछ नहीं किया। इन्होंने एचएएल को लेकर तरह तरह के झूठ फैलाए, विवाद खड़े करने की कोशिश की। इन्होंने फैक्ट्रियों के बाहर धरना प्रदर्शन करवाए, कर्मचारियों को भड़काने की कोशिश की। लेकिन आज वही एचएएल रिकॉर्ड मुनाफे वाली कंपनी बनकर उभरी है। जब नीतियां स्पष्ट होती हैं, नीयत साफ होती है, तो अच्छे परिणाम भी मेरे नासिक के भाई बहन देख रहे हैं। डिफेंस सेक्टर में आत्मनिर्भर भारत की ताकत बन रही है। साथियों, कांग्रेस और इसके साथियों को न बाबा साहब आंबेडकर के संविधान की परवाह है, न कोर्ट की और न ही देश की भावना की। ये सिर्फ दिखावे के लिए जेब में खाली पन्नों वाले संविधान की किताब लेकर घूमते हैं। कल आपने देखा, उनकी पोल खुल गई। जब संविधान की रक्षा की बात आती है, जब संविधान के सम्मान की बात आती है, ते उल्टा ही काम करते हैं। ये कांग्रेस वाले ऐसे हैं, 75 साल तक जम्मू कश्मीर में बाबा साहब आंबेडकर के संविधान को लागू नहीं होने दिया। 75 साल तक देश में एक संविधान नहीं था। 370 की ऐसी दीवार बना दी थी कि बाबा साहब आंबेडकर का संविधान वहां घुस ही नहीं सकता था। भाजपा एनडीए आर्टिकल 370 को हटाया और एक देश एक संविधान लागू किया। और मेरी बाबा साहब आंबेडकर को सबसे बड़ी श्रद्धांजलि है। जब भारत का संविधान जम्मू कश्मीर में लागू हुआ, पूरा देश झूम उठा था, नाच उठा था। मैं जरा मेरे नासिक के लोगों को पूछना चाहता हूं, नासिक के लोग बताइए, क्या आर्टिकल 370 हटने से आपको खुशी हुई कि नहीं हुई? जरा जोर से बताइए, खुशी हुई कि नहीं हुई? ये कांग्रेस वालों के कान फट जाए ऐसे बोलिए, खुशी हुई कि नहीं हुई? आपको खुशी हुई, लेकिन कांग्रेस और उसके साथियों के पेट में चूहे दौड़ने लग गए। उनको दर्द हो गया। आपने टीवी पे देखा होगा, 2-3 दिन पहले जम्मू कश्मीर की विधानसभा में कांग्रेस और इसके साथियों ने 370 फिर से लागू करने के लिए हंगामा किया। ये लोग फिर चाहते हैं कि जम्मू कश्मीर से बाबा साहब आंबेडकर का संविधान फिर से जम्मू कश्मीर से निकाल दिया जाए, हटा दिया जाए। ये लोग फिर चाहते हैं कि वहां दलितों को, वाल्मीकि समाज को जो आरक्षण 75 साल बाद मिला है, उसे छीन लिया जाए। संविधान के विरुद्ध, दलितों, पिछड़ों, आदिवासियों के विरुद्ध इसी साजिश में जितनी गुनहगार कांग्रेस है, उतने ही अगाड़ी के उनके बाकी साथी दल भी हैं। साथियों, चुनाव के समय पार्टियां अपने कामकाज का हिसाब देकर जनता के बीच जाती है। बीजेपी और महायुति भी लगातार अपने काम का हिसाब दे रही है, लेकिन बीजेपी का मुकाबला करने के लिए कांग्रेस के पास एक ही तरीका है। कांग्रेस उसके साथियों की झूठ की दुकान, यही दुकान इन दिनों कांग्रेस और उसके चेलों ने महाराष्ट्र में लगाई है। कांग्रेस ने कर्नाटका, तेलंगाना और हिमाचल में भी यही झूठ की दुकान सजाई थी, और वहां क्या हाल हुआ? चुनाव खत्म हुए, दुकान का शटर गिर गया। वादे पूरा करना तो दूर, कांग्रेस शासित राज्यों में हाल ये है कि सरकार चलाने के पैसे इनके पास नहीं है, तनख्वाह देने के पैसे नहीं है। खर्चों के लिए और अपनी जेबें भरने के लिए जनता पर टैक्स बढ़ाया जा रहा है, जनता से वसूली हो रही है। जनता भी इनकी असलियत जान गई है। महाराष्ट्र की जनता भी देख रही है कि एक तरफ महायुति का घोषणा पत्र है, वहीं दूसरी तरफ महाअगाड़ी का घोटाला पत्र है। क्योंकि ये पक्का है, जहां कांग्रेस और उसके साथी होंगे वहां घोटाला होगा ही होगा। ये लोग ऐसी योजनाओं की घोषणा करते हैं जिसमें से ज्यादा भ्रष्टाचार हो सके। आप महाराष्ट्र में इन लोगों को ये सारा पाप फिर से करने देंगे क्या? करने देंगे क्या? ये धोखेबाजी महाराष्ट्र की जनता के बीच चलेगी क्या? साथियों, पूरे देश ने कांग्रेस की हरकतों के कारण उसे पूरी तरह से खारिज कर दिया है। कांग्रेस अब ऑल इंडिया कांग्रेस नहीं बची। कांग्रेस अब परजीवी कांग्रेस बन चुकी है। ये कांग्रेस पार्टी अब केवल बैसाखियों पर ही जिंदा है। महाराष्ट्र हो, उत्तर प्रदेश हो, बिहार हो, झारखंड हो, ज्यादातर राज्यों में कांग्रेस दूसरी पार्टियों के सहारे ही चुनाव लड़ने की हालत में है। वो अपने पैरों पर खड़ी नहीं रह सकती। इसलिए साथियों, कांग्रेस ने राजनीति में खुद को बचाने के लिए अपना सबसे बड़ा हथियार चला है। ये हथियार है एससी, एसटी, ओबीसी समाज की एकता तोड़ो, एकता तोड़ो और राज छीनो। कांग्रेस के लोग जनजातीय समूह, शेड्यूल्ड ट्राइब, हमारे आदिवासी, एसटी को बांटना चाहते हैं। कांग्रेस के लोग हमारे दलित भाई बहन, एससी को बांटना चाहते हैं। कांग्रेस के लोग ओबीसी को बांटना चाहते हैं। साथियों, कांग्रेस के रहते ओबीसी कभी इतना एकजुट नहीं हो पाया। ओबीसी को आरक्षण भी तभी मिला जब कांग्रेस सरकार हटी। नेहरू जी के समय में कांग्रेस ने ओबीसी को अलग अलग जातियों में बांट करके रखा। फिर इंदिरा गांधी जी का भी वही रवैया था। बाद में राजीव गांधी जी आए। इन लोगों ने कभी ओबीसी को एकजुट नहीं होने दिया। और 90 के दशक में जैसे ही ओबीसी एकजुट हुआ, ओबीसी एक ताकत बना, ओबीसी अपने हकों के लिए जागरूक बना, ओबीसी देश की भलाई के लिए कुछ करने के लिए आगे आया। और इसका पहला नतीजा क्या आया? जैसे ओबीसी ताकतवर बना भारत में, उसके बाद कांग्रेस की पूर्ण बहुमत वाली सरकार बनना बंद हो गया, उनका शटर गिर गया। और इसलिए कांग्रेस को ऐसा गुस्सा है कि ओबीसी 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 आया कि हमारी दुकान बंद होती गई। और इसलिए कांग्रेस चाहती है कि ओबीसी समाज को कमजोर कर दो भाई, उनकी एकजुटता को समाप्त कर दो। कांग्रेस का स्पष्ट मत है कि ओबीसी कमजोर होगा तभी कांग्रेस के लिए सत्ता का रास्ता खुलेगा। इसलिए कांग्रेस ओबीसी को बांटकर उनमें दरारें पैदा करना चाहती है। यहां नासिक और इस क्षेत्र में कितनी ही ओबीसी जातियां हैं, कुणबी, माली, वाणी, गुजर, कुंभार, नावी, सुतार, सोनार, देवड़ीगा, धांगर, धनगिरी, गंवाड़ी, शेटवाल, माली, मालिस, नामदेव, आहिर, तंबोली, धावड़, जाटगर, धाकड़ बैरागी, सैगर, कितने सारे। कांग्रेस इन सारी जातियों को आपस में लड़ाना चाहती है। कांग्रेस चाहती है कुणबी ये जाति माली से लड़े, वाणी जाति गुजर से लड़े, कुंभार साथी नावी से लड़े। कांग्रेस चाहती है कि सुतार सोनार से भिड़ जाए। कांग्रेस ओबीसी के तौर पर आपको एकजुट नहीं होना देना चाहती। इसलिए वो चाहती है देवड़ीगा डांगर से लड़े, धनगरी गवांडी से टकराए, नामदेव आहिर से उलझे। कांग्रेस का इरादा है तंबोली दावड़ से झगड़ा करे, जाटगर सैगर से लड़ाई करे। आपकी एकजुटता को तबाह करने के लिए कांग्रेस मैदान में उतरी है। आपकी एकता से, आपकी मजबूती से कांग्रेस को सबसे ज्यादा तकलीफ है। इसलिए वो चाहती है कि ओबीसी अपनी एकजुटता खो दें और कांग्रेस के लिए सत्ता का रास्ता खुल जाए। मैं आपसे पूछता हूं, जब ओबीसी अलग अलग जातियों में बटेंगे तो कमजोर होंगे कि नहीं होंगे? जरा पूरी ताकत से बताइए, कमजोर होंगे कि नहीं होंगे? आपकी ताकत घटेगी कि नहीं घटेगी? और इसलिए आपको याद रखना है, मेरा तो एक ही मंत्र है, हम एक है तो सेफ है। हम एक है तो सेफ है। सच्चाई यही है कि कांग्रेस ओबीसी से नफरत करती है। आज ओबीसी समाज का एक व्यक्ति लगातार 140 करोड़ देशवासियों के आशीर्वाद लेकर तीसरी बार देश का प्रधानमंत्री बना है। कांग्रेस को हजम नहीं हो रहा है, ओबीसी, वो भी इतनी छोटी जाति का, वो कैसे प्रधानमंत्री बन गया और 60 साल के बाद तीसरी बार बनने वाला बन गया। उनको नींद नहीं आ रही है और इसलिए गुस्सा ओबीसी समाज पे निकाल रहे हैं। साथियों, यहां हमें आशीर्वाद देने के लिए इतनी बड़ी संख्या में माताएं, बहनें, बेटियां आई है। आपको याद रखना है, ये महाआघाड़ी वाले महाराष्ट्र की महिलाओं के सबसे बड़े दुश्मन है। आप जानते हैं, आज पूरे देश में महाराष्ट्र की एक योजना की बहुत चर्चा हो रही है। हर एक की जुबान पे वो चर्चा है, माझी लाड़की बहन योजना, माझी लाड़की बहन योजना। हमारी बहन बेटियों को इस योजना का लाभ हो रहा है, लेकिन ये जो कांग्रेस और अघाड़ी वाले हैं, इन्हें इस योजना के लिए बहुत तकलीफ हो रही है। इस योजना को बंद कराने के लिए ये लोग कोर्ट तक चले गए हैं। भाई और बहनों, बीजेपी और महायुति महिलाओं के सम्मान और प्रगति के लिए समर्पित है। केंद्र सरकार की नीतियों से आज महिलाएं सशक्त और समर्थन बन रही है। हम 3 करोड़ बहनों को लखपति दीदी बना रहे हैं। महिलाएं आज ड्रोन दीदी बन रही है, देश की प्रगति में सक्रिय भूमिका निभा रही है। आज हम गरीबों को प्रधानमंत्री आवास दे रहे हैं, तो वो भी घर की महिलाओं के नाम पर दिए जा रहे हैं। अभी केंद्र में नई सरकार बनने के 100 दिन के भीतर ही हमने 3 करोड़ नए घरों को भी मंजूरी दी है। अच्छा, मेरा एक काम करोगे भाई? जरा हाथ ऊपर करके बताइए, मेरा एक काम करोगे? पक्का करोगे? देखिए, आज चुनाव में आप लोग घर घर जाने वाले हो, हर गांव जाएंगे, मोहल्ले में जाएंगे, लोगों से मिलेंगे। अगर आपको कहीं पर भी कोई परिवार कच्चे घर में रह रहा है, कोई परिवार झोपड़पट्टी में रह रहा है, तो उसको जाके कहना कि मोदी जी ने मुझे भेजा है, अब तेरा घर पक्का बन के रहेगा। ये कहेंगे और उसका नाम पता लिख करके मुझे भेज देना। देखिए, आप ही मेरे लिए मोदी है। आप जाकर के वादा कर देना मैंने ठान के रखा है, मैं गरीब के पक्के घर बनाऊंगा। हमने महिलाओं को विधानसभा और लोकसभा पहुंचाने के लिए नारी वंदन अधिनियम भी पास कराया है। यानी जिन बहन बेटियों को कांग्रेस ने इतने दशकों तक शौचालय और सुरक्षा तक से वंचित रखा, अब वही विकसित भारत का चेहरा बनेगी। साथियों, ये चुनाव एक और महाराष्ट्र के भविष्य का चुनाव है। साथ ही ये महाराष्ट्र के सम्मान का और स्वाभिमान का चुनाव भी है। एक और बीजेपी और महायुति है, जिसके लिए मराठी संस्कृति और इतिहास ये हमारी आस्था के केंद्र है। हमारी केंद्र सरकार ने मराठी भाषा को अभिजात भाषा का दर्जा दिया है। हमने मराठी को वो पहचान दी, ये महान भाषा जिसकी पहले से हकदार है। हमने छत्रपति शिवाजी महाराज के आदर्शों की बात की, उनके सम्मान को आगे बढ़ाया। बीजेपी गर्व से कहती है कि वीर सावरकर हमारे प्रेरणा स्रोत है। वीर सावरकर महाराष्ट्र और राष्ट्र के गौरव है। लेकिन दूसरी ओर कांग्रेस और उसके पीछे लगे महाआघाड़ी के लोग, आप इनकी सोच और मानसिकता देखिए। कांग्रेस ने कभी मराठी भाषा को अभिजात भाषा का दर्जा नहीं मिलने दिया। कांग्रेस के लोग घूम घूम कर वीर सावरकर को गाली देते हैं। कांग्रेस के नेता गाली देते हैं। महाराष्ट्र की धरती पर आकर के वीर सावरकर का अपमान करते हैं। और मैंने सुना है कि महाराष्ट्र के आघाड़ी के कुछ नेताओं ने कांग्रेस के युवराज को बिठाया, उसको कहा, भाई महाराष्ट्र में चुनाव जीतना है, तुम वीर सावरकर को अभी गाली देना कुछ दिन बंद करो। उसके मुंह पे ताला लगाया, गाली बोलना बंद करो। और ये देखिए आघाड़ी वाले, सबसे बड़ा दुर्भाग्य ये है कि सावरकर की विरासत का दम भरने वाले आज आघाड़ी में कांग्रेस के साथ खड़े हो गए हैं। मैं कांग्रेस के महाआघाड़ी वाले साथियों को चुनौती देता हूं। ये चुनौती मेरी महाआघाड़ी वालों को है। ये पार्टियां कांग्रेस के युवराज के मुंह से, कांग्रेस के नेताओं से वीर सावरकर के तप, त्याग, बलिदान के कम से कम 15 मिनट रोज अपने भाषण में प्रशंसा करके जरा दिखा दे। एक युवराज कभी भी वीर सावरकर की प्रशंसा करने की हिम्मत नहीं करेगा। वीर सावरकर की काले पानी के दिन काल कोठी में बताए उनका वो कठिनतम समय और देश की आजादी के लिए लिया हुआ प्राण। कांग्रेस सब कुछ खारिज करती है। महाआघाड़ी वाले दल कांग्रेस से वीर सावरकर के काले पानी वाले दिनों की जरा प्रशंसा करके दिखाए। आजादी की लड़ाई में वीर सावरकर ने कितने ही क्रांतिकारियों को प्रेरणा दी। महाआघाड़ी वाले दल कांग्रेस से ऐसे प्रेरणादायी वीर सावरकर की तारीफ करवाकर जरा दिखाए। साथियों, देश और महाराष्ट्र की राजनीति में बाला साहब ठाकरे का योगदान अतुलनीय है। लेकिन कांग्रेस के नेताओं के मुंह से बाला साहब की प्रशंसा भी उसके लिए एक शब्द नहीं निकलता है। मैं आघाड़ी में कांग्रेस के दोस्तों को ये भी चुनौती देता हूं, वो कांग्रेस के नेताओं से युवराज के मुंह से बाला साहब ठाकरे की, उनकी विचारधारा की सार्वजनिक रूप से प्रशंसा करके दिखाएं। आज 8 नवंबर है, मैं दिन गिनूंगा और महाआघाड़ी वालों से जवाब का इंतजार करूंगा कि वो सावरकर जी की प्रशंसा करते हैं कि नहीं करते हैं, बाला साहब की ठाकरे के तप की प्रशंसा करते हैं कि नहीं करते। महाराष्ट्र भी देखेगा और हम गिनेंगे, आप भी गिनना। साथियों, इस चुनाव में आपको बीजेपी और महायुति के उम्मीदवारों को विजयी बनाना है। मैं आपसे आशीर्वाद मांगने के लिए आया। मैं आपको विश्वास दिलाता हूं, महाराष्ट्र में आने वाली सरकार बड़े फैसलों के लिए काम करेगी। आप प्रभु श्री राम की तपोभूमि नासिक से हमारे चुनाव अभियान की शुरुआत श्री प्रभु श्री राम के आशीर्वाद से जरूर सफल होगी। हम सब मिलकर विकसित महाराष्ट्र का सपना पूरा करेंगे। आप आए, इसके लिए मैं एक बार फिर आप सभी का आभार प्रकट करता हूं। जो चुनाव लड़ रहे हैं, सभी उम्मीदवारों से मेरा आग्रह है कि आगे आ जाए। जो इस असेंबली का चुनाव लड़ रहे हैं, जरा साथी आगे आ जाए। जो चुनाव लड़ रहे हैं, आठवले जी, आपको तो मेरे साथ रहना है, वहां यहां वापस नहीं आना है। हाँ। अध्यक्ष जी, आप भी तो चुनाव लड़ रहे हो। हाँ। भाजन, रामदास आ जाइए। मेरे साथ बोलिए, भारत माता की, भारत माता की। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
धन्यवाद।
Wouldn't it be great if you could hire the right people with the right skills? With LinkedIn Talent Solutions, you can find and hire highly qualified candidates smarter and faster. Make the place.
Being real suits you. Wedding Collection by Blackberries.
Spring Boot is one of the most widely used technologies to build web applications in Java. Hi all, I welcome you all to this full course session on Spring Boot, and what follows is the complete crash course on the same. But before we begin, let's take a look at today's agenda. So we'll start off with introduction to Spring Boot, where we'll understand what is Spring Boot, its features, its market trends, and the differences between Spring and Spring Boot. After that, we'll look into how to set up and install Spring Boot, and then we'll look into the MVC architecture. So in the MVC architecture, we'll understand what is MVC and its workflow. Once that is done, we'll look into the dependency injection. So over here, we'll understand what is dependency injection, its benefits, its types, and then understand a hands-on of the same. After that, we'll look into how to create a web application using Spring Boot, where we'll look into how to pass a client's data to a web application. Once that is done, we'll look into how to create a submission form in Spring Boot, where we'll look into how to connect a database to a web application. After that, we'll discuss what is REST API and its methods. And over here, we'll also discuss the Spring Data REST methods. Later on, we'll look into the Spring Data REST and understand how to retrieve the data from the database. After that, I'll talk about how to secure your applications in Spring Boot. And finally, I'll end this session by discussing the top interview questions related to Spring Boot. On that note, I come to an end to my today's agenda. But before we begin with the session, I would like to request all of you to subscribe to our EduReka YouTube channel to get daily notified on the top trending technologies. On that note, let's get started.
Let's start with the first topic for today's session, that is, what is Spring Boot? Now, if I have to explain you what is Spring Boot, then Spring Boot is basically a Spring module which aims to simplify the use of Spring framework for Java development. It is used to create standalone Spring-based applications which you can just run. So it basically removes a lot of configuration and dependencies and aims at rapid application development. So the Spring Boot framework comes with auto dependency resolution, embedded HTTP servers, auto configuration, management endpoints, and Spring Boot CLI. So if I have to summarize Spring Boot for you, then Spring Boot basically makes it easy to create Spring-powered production-grade applications. It takes an opinionated view of the Spring platform, and it is used to create standalone Java applications. So I hope that you've understood what is Spring Boot. It's just a Spring framework which is used for Java development. So on that note, let's look into the features of Spring Boot. So the features of Spring Boot are, as you can see on my screen. We have Spring Boot CLI, the starter dependency, the Spring initializer, the auto configuration, the Spring actuator, and logging and security. Talking about Spring Boot CLI first. Basically, the CLI allows you to use Groovy for writing Spring Boot applications and avoids the boilerplate codes. Coming to starter dependency, with the help of this feature, Spring Boot aggregates common dependencies together and eventually improves the productivity of your application. Moving on to Spring initializer, this is basically a web application which can create internal project structure for you. And moving on to the next one, that is auto configuration. The auto configuration feature of Spring Boot helps in loading the default configurations according to the project that you're working on. Coming to Spring Actuator, this particular feature provides help while running Spring Boot applications. And finally, coming to logging and security, this feature of Spring Boot ensures that all the applications made using Spring Boot are properly secured without any hassle. So guys, these are a few features of Spring Boot, that is Spring Boot CLI, starter dependency, initializer, auto configuration, actuator, and logging and security. So now that I've spoken about the features of Spring Boot, if you ask me why do we need Spring Boot, then I would say these are few points through which we can say that, we need Spring Boot. As you know, Spring Boot provides stability. It is based on Java virtual machine. So you can basically connect to any Java project that you want to, and then you can have rapid application development in Java. It provides good connectivity with other technologies like, all the web technologies or even the other databases like MySQL, PostgreSQL, Oracle, and so on. It's cloud native, it provides good flexibility, and is open source, right? So any of us can just install Spring Boot into our systems and then we can get started with it. On that note, let me tell you over here that, Spring Boot can be used by any of us. So it can be a full stack developer or it can be a Java developer. So if you're someone who's trying to switch your career, or maybe you're looking for some skill that you want to enhance, then you can definitely get started with Spring Boot. As you know, Spring Boot is one of the top technologies in today's market for application development. So a Java developer with knowledge of Spring Boot earns around $1 lakh. Similarly, the senior Java developer earns around $120, that is $119 that you can see on my screen. And full stack developer also earns a whopping amount of around $1 lakh. So that's a huge amount, right? So any of us can start learning Spring Boot. So on that note, let's take this session forward and understand the differences between Spring and Spring Boot. Now, as both of them sound the same, that both of them have the similar name, Spring and Spring Boot, these terms are often one of the most confused terms, as all of us think that both of them are same. But yes, there's a little bit difference in both of them. Talking about Spring first, Spring takes time to have the Spring application up and running, but whereas in Spring Boot doesn't take so much of time as that of Spring. It takes shorter time to run the Spring application. Coming to Spring again, Spring manages the life cycle of Java, but whereas in Spring Boot, if you use Spring Boot, then you do not have to worry about configuring your data source as it provides auto configuration feature. Moving on to Spring again, Spring provides the dependency injection framework, as the Spring Boot has pre-configured set of frameworks and technologies. So if I have to just summarize the differences of Spring and Spring Boot for you, then Spring is basically a web application framework based on Java and provides tools and libraries to create customized web applications. Basically, it's more complex than Spring Boot and takes an unopinionated view. But whereas when we look at Spring Boot is a module of Spring and is used to create a Spring application project which we can just run or execute. Spring Boot is less complex when compared to that of Spring Framework and takes an opinionated view of the platform. So guys, I hope that you've understood the differences between Spring and Spring Boot.
We're excited to introduce conditional remote configs on ByteBrew. Using ByteBrew conditions, you can distribute live remote configs to different segments of players based on attributes like build version, country, custom data, and more, enabling you to create curated in-game experiences for segments of players without having to constantly update the app stores. So, what are you waiting for? Sign up now and start using ByteBrew in your game free today.
माझी लाडकी बहीण योजना,
मोफत वीज योजना
यांच्यासारखीच तुम्ही ही सवय लावून घ्या, पण प्रगतीची. अजित दादांसोबत
येत्या 20 नोव्हेंबरला घड्याळाचे बटन दाबा.
So on that note, let's take a look at the next topic for today's session, that is how to install and set up Spring Boot. Now to install and set up Spring Boot, there are mainly two ways. That is either you use the Spring Boot CLI or you use the Spring Toolsuite plugin in your Eclipse IDE or IntelliJ. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to install both of them, and then I'll show you how you can run your programs. Before I move forward, let's take a look at the system requirements for Spring Boot. So the system requirements for Spring Boot are as you can see on my screen. Well, the Spring Boot 2.1.7 release basically requires Java 8 plus version and a Spring framework of 5.1.9 plus. It needs explicit build support of Maven 3.3 version plus and Gradle 4.4 version plus, and also needs servlet container support like Tomcat 9.0 version, that is basically servlet version 4.0, the Jetty 9.4 which has basically servlet version 3.1, and Undertow 2.0 that is servlet version 4.0. So basically these are few system requirements that Spring Boot needs, guys. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to show you how to install Java, because for that you can refer to our sessions on Java. But yes, I'm going to show you how to install and set up Spring Boot CLI. So let's get started with installation and setup of Spring Boot CLI. Now to install and set up the Spring Boot CLI, you have to first download the Apache Maven and Spring Boot CLI from their respective official websites. So let me first download the Apache Maven and then we'll download the Spring Boot CLI. So initially what I'm going to do is I'm going to first set up the Maven and then I'm going to set up the Spring Boot CLI. So this is from where I'm going to download the Apache Maven, right? So you basically have to download the zip file. So the zip file is getting downloaded. So let's just wait for that to happen. And once the zip file gets downloaded, you have to extract the zip file to a specific folder. And then you can start setting up the Maven. So let's just wait for our folder to be installed. So let's just wait for the folder to be downloaded. Alright, so as you can see on my screen, my Apache Maven bin file has been downloaded. So what I'll do is I'll just copy this particular folder from here, and let's say I put it in my C directory, right? So let's say I just paste it over here, right? So let's just wait for that to happen. This is basically where I'm trying to unzip the folder. I'm just unzipping the folder and then I'm copying it to the C directory. Now, once the folder is downloaded, what you have to do is you have to basically go to my computer, right? So let's say I go to this PC, right? And then I right click over here. I go to properties. Now, once I go to properties, I have to basically go to advanced system settings, and then I'll basically go to environment variables, right? So basically, guys, this is where you have to add the environment variables for our Maven folder, right? So over here, I'll add basically two variables, that is m2_home and Maven home variable. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to new over here, and let's say I mention m2_home, and in variable value, what I'll do is I'll basically go to browse directory. I'll go to this PC and let's say I go to C file, right? And then what I'll do is I'll just choose Apache Maven and then I'll click on OK. So this is where I click on OK for M2 home. Similarly, I'll do the same thing for Maven home. So I'll again add new, and then I'll mention Maven underscore home, right? And the variable value, I'll go to browse, I'll go to this PC, I'll go to C, and then I'll choose Apache Maven, and then I'll click on OK. Now, once I click on OK, we basically have to update the path variable, right? So to update the path variable, what I'll do is I'll just click on OK over here, and then I'll search for the path variable, right? I'll go to edit option over here. And once I go to edit option, what I'm going to do is I'm going to append the Maven's bin folder to this particular path. So what I'll do is I'll just go to new, and then I'll just go back to the folder. And then what I'll do is I'll just open this particular folder. I'll open the bin file, right? So I'll copy this particular section over here. And then what I'll do is I'll go to new over here. I'll paste it over here, right? And then I'll click on OK. Now, once that is done, what I'll do is I'll click on OK again over here, and then I'll click OK again over here. And now to check whether Maven is installed or not, we can just use the Maven version command. So for that, I'll open my command prompt. We just type in the command mvn-version, right? So when I type in the command mvn-version, you can see that, Apache Maven 3.5.2 has been successfully installed. So that's how, guys, basically you can install and set up Apache Maven. Now the next step is to basically download the Spring Boot CLI tool from its official website, right? So let's just do the same, right? So I'm just going to this particular website, and let's say, I download the 2.1.8 release. So when I click on the 2.1.8 release, let's say, I download the zip file of it, right? So I'll just download it, and let's just wait for it to happen. And then again, similarly, we have to add a Spring Home variable in the Windows environment variables list. And then we have to update the path variable. So let's just wait for that to happen. All right. So as you can see, my Spring Boot CLI version 2.1.8 release has got downloaded, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to basically install this particular CLI. Right, so to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this particular folder, right? So it has all the bin files that you can see on my screen, right? So I'll go back over here, I'll copy, and then let's say, I put it in the C directory again. So I go to the C directory, and then I paste. Now, once it is copied into the C directory, we'll again do the same. We'll go to the environment variables. So that's again, you go to Windows, you go to this PC, then you go to properties, and then you choose advanced system settings, and then you see this particular Windows, right? Over here, what you have to do is you have to add a new variable. So I'll just go to new again, and let's say I mention the name to be Spring underscore home. Let me just mention the variable value. So for that, I'll just browse directory, and then I'll go to the C folder, right? So for that, we go to this PC, then we choose C, and over here, I'll choose the Spring 2.1.8 release, and then I click on OK. Now, once that is done, again, you have to update the path variable. So I'll go to the path variable. I'll go to edit option over here. And then what I'll do is I'll add a new variable, right? So I'll go over here, right? And then what I'll do is I'll go back to the folder. I'll go to the bin file, and then I'll copy this particular path, and then I'll paste it over here, right? After that, I'll click on OK. Then I'll click on OK again over here. Now to check whether, the Spring Boot CLI is installed or not, we go to command prompt, right? So let me just open a new command prompt again. And over here, let's go to the folder bin where I'd installed. So basically, if you see, I'd installed in C, and then we have a Spring folder and then the bin folder. So I'll just come out of this particular directory, and then I'll change to CD Spring, and then I'll change to bin. And now what I'll do is I'll mention the command Spring -version. So once I mention the command Spring -version, you can clearly see that, Spring CLI version 2.1.8 release has been there. So that's how, guys, basically you can install Spring Boot CLI manually. Right now, if you have a project of Spring Boot, to execute the project using Spring Boot CLI, you basically have to use the command mvn spring-boot:run. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave that part to you. But yet, let's get back to our session, and let's see how to install and set up Spring Tool Suite. Now to install and set up Spring Tool Suite, it's very simple, guys. You basically have to choose an ID. So that could be either your Eclipse ID or IntelliJ, right? So over here, I've chosen the Eclipse ID. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to close all these sections, right? So there's no further confusion. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the Eclipse ID for you, right? So let's just wait for that to happen. Once you click on the icon for Eclipse ID, you basically see this particular launcher which says select a directory as workspace. So I'll just keep it as it is, and I'll click on launch. Now, once I click on launch, you'll see that, Eclipse is opening up. So let's just wait for that to happen. Now, once Eclipse opens up, this is basically the screen that you see, guys. So on the left-hand side, you have various projects that you've worked on. This is where the output comes, and this is the outline for your project, right? So basically over here, you can see all the classes and the methods that you use in a specific project. Now, as I was talking about Spring Tool Suite, now Spring Tool Suite is basically a plugin that you can use in Eclipse IDE. So to install Spring Tool Suite, what you have to do is you have to go to Help over here. Then you have to go to Eclipse Marketplace. And over here, what you can do is you can basically search for Spring Tool Suite. Right? So let's just search. All right. Now, once you search for Spring Tool Suite, you clearly see this particular plugin, that's Spring Tools 4 for Spring Boot, aka Spring Tool Suite 4 4.4.0 release, right? So since I've already installed into my system, I'm not going to install and show you again. But yes, if you want to install, you just have to click on this install button that comes over here. And then you just have to keep clicking on next. Once you click on next, you'll see that, after a while, Spring Tool Suite has been installed onto your system. Apart from this, if you want a detailed session on how to install also, I'll leave a link in the description box below, and then you can refer to that particular session to install Spring Tool Suite. So that's how, guys, basically you can set up and install both Spring Boot CLI and Spring Tool Suite. Now, once you've set up both of them, you can use either of them. It's not necessary that, you have to use both of them together, right? It's completely your choice which you want to choose. For this particular session, I'm going to use the Spring Tool Suite with Eclipse IDE because it's really easy to create projects and add dependencies using Eclipse IDE. So for this particular session, we'll be using Eclipse IDE, but yes, you can go forward and implement projects using CLI. So on that note, let's get started with the first project for today's session, that is the Hello World program. Now, this is one of the simplest programs that anybody would want to know on how to create a project. So I'm going to show you the Hello World program just to make sure that you understand how to create a Spring Boot project and what are the required necessities that you have to add to a project, right? So let's get started. So to create a Hello World program, what you have to do is you have to go to File and then you have to go to New. And then once you go to New, you either see a Spring Starter project option over here. Else what you have to do is you have to go to Other. And then you have to search for Spring Boot, as you can see on my screen. And then you have to just choose the Spring Starter project. After that, you have to click on Next. Now, once you click on Next, this is the screen that you see where you have to basically choose the group ID, the artifact ID, the description for your project, the package name, and so on. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mention the name to be Hello World. And then the name of project will be artifact ID automatically. The group name will be com.example and the package name will be com.example.demo. And let's say the description to be Hello World project. Now, once that is done, you can also check the type to be Maven, the Java version to be 8, packaging to be jar, and language to be Java. After that, you can click on Next. Now, once you click on Next, the next thing that you have to do is you basically have to add the dependencies for your project. So this is where you have to add the dependencies, guys, in Spring Tool Suite. But yes, if you're writing a separate project file, then you have to copy the dependency codes from the official websites and then you have to paste it over here. So since, we know which dependencies are required. So since I'm creating a Hello World project, I want it to run on a specific URL, right? So basically I want it to run on a local host, let's say 8081 and / and let's say I mention it to be hello. I want it to run on a specific URL. So that means I need the web dependencies. So I'll search for web. Once I search for web, you see that, we get Spring Web and Spring Web Services. So I'll just check in all the three of them and then I'll click on Finish. Right. So guys, this is basically a simple project that I'm creating. But yes, further in the session, you'll see much more complicated projects that we'll be creating with various kinds of dependencies. Now, once the project is created, you can see on the left hand side that, we've got a Hello World project. So over here, if you see, we have an example demo. And then in this particular folder, we have our Hello World application Java file, right? So let me just open that and show you. So in this code, you can clearly see that, we see an error for the package that is, com.example.demo does not exist, right? So what I'll do is I'll just move the Hello World application Java file to this particular package. Okay, so it says it does not exist. So I'll just delete this particular section. So what I'll do is I'll just remove the declaration of package. So this is how basically the application class looks, guys. Over here, we have the import facility. So this is from where we import basically the various dependencies that you want. And then we have an @Spring Boot application annotation. Well, this particular annotation is basically used to enable the auto configuration and also to indicate the application that it is a Spring Boot application. Then we have a public class with the name, and then we have a public static void main statement, and then we have a statement which says spring application.run and in brackets hello world application.class.arguments, right? So this statement basically indicates that, whenever we execute this particular project, automatically this particular class must be executed. Now, but the question is, how do we get to the URL and how do we mention hello world? For that, you basically have to create a controller class, or maybe you can say that, you have to add a new file, right? So for that, what I'll do is I'll just right click over here. And then what I'll do is I'll add a new class, right? So let's say I mention the class name to be configuration, right? So we'll just mention app configuration and then we can choose the modifier. So over here, I'll let it be public and let's say I click on finish, right? So once I click on finish, you can see that, automatically we have got this app configuration class. Now what we have to do is you basically have to insert the URL, right? So for that, we have to use the @request. That I'll mention @request mapping, and in the brackets I'll basically mention /hello over here. And then what I'll do is I'll have to mention the text, right? So to mention the text, we'll basically mention public string. I'll mention string and let's say we mention a method hello, right? And in the brackets, what I'll mention is return hello world, and then I'll just close this particular statement. And over here, you clearly see an error on request mapping, right? So that's because, we've not imported the required libraries for request mapping. So for that, what I'll do is I'll just put my cursor over here. And then you see that, we'll get a suggestion. So let's just wait for that to come, right? So I'll just click on import request mapping. And then you can see that, the error at @request mapping has gone, right? So what's basically happening over here is basically that, I'm mentioning the URL. So what I'll do is I'll mention localhost : I'll mention the port number / and then if we mention hello, it has to return hello world. So over here, there's one more thing that you have to mention is the REST controller. That is because, we're playing around with URLs, right? So what I'll do is above the public class statement, I'll just mention REST controller, right? And then I'll import the required annotation. And then that's all. Now, once that is done, you can just save your file and then you can go and execute. But this particular application will initially run on localhost 8080. But it may often happen that, our 8080 port is busy, right? So for that, we have to configure the port. Now to configure the port, what you have to do is you have to go to the source main resources folder where you see application properties file. But before that, let me just zoom in a little bit so that the code is clear to you guys, right? So I'll just go to the application properties file and then I'll mention over here server.port, let's say 8081, right? And then I'll click on save. Right, so basically our application will run on localhost : 8081/hello, and if it executes, we'll get an output as hello world. So that's how, guys, basically you can write a code for a hello world application. Now, before I execute, I would just like to go through all the steps that we did. So initially, we just created a project using the Spring tool suite. So we went to File and then we chose Spring Starter Project. And over there, we mentioned the group ID, artifact ID, name, description, and so on, right? After that, we added the required dependencies that will basically go into the pom.xml file. Now, talking about the pom.xml file, let me just open the file and show you once. So let's just wait for that to happen. All right. Now, if I just extend my screen, you can clearly see that, the pom.xml file is basically a file where all your metadata is present regarding the project, right? So you have basically the parent, the group ID, and then in the group ID, it basically has all the details like, what group ID did we mention? What's the artifact ID? What's the version? What's the project name? And then what is the Java version which is getting used? What are the dependencies added like, Jersey, web services, test, and so on? And then what are the plugins used? And then what is the Spring Boot version and so on? So if you're working on any project, then your POM file is the go-to solution to find out the metadata for the project, right? So often what happens is that when you work on large projects, most of the time we get dependency issues. So this is where you solve the dependency issues. So let's go back to our application over here. And then over here, we saw that, we have the @Spring Boot application annotation to just indicate that, it's a Spring Boot application. And then we have a Spring application.run statement, which says that, this particular class has to be executed when we execute this particular project. And then we have an app configuration class, which is basically the configuration file to this particular class. And this will help us handle the HTTP request. So over here, I'm just using the request mapping annotation to basically retrieve the text hello world. So now let me just execute this particular project. So for that, you have to right click over here on the project and then you can choose run as, and then you can choose Spring Boot app. So to resolve this error, what I've done is that, I just added the package com.example.demo back to this particular file. And only since we have the main class and the app configuration class inside this package, it's important to mention the package name, right? So we'll mention the package name to be com.example.demo. That's basically a package name. And then the rest of the code remains the same. Now what I'll do is I'll just right click over here, go to Run As and choose Spring Boot app. Alright, now once I click on Spring Boot app, you can see that our application has started. Over here you can clearly see the output that Tomcat started on port number 8081 and our application Hello World has started. So I'll just open a new tab so that the outputs are clear to you, and then I'll mention localhost :8081/hello. Right, now once I mention hello, you can clearly see an output of Hello World. So I hope this part is clear to you guys. I hope you have understood how to create a Hello World application and how you can create a simple Spring Boot project. So I'll just basically close this application running. So basically I'll stop this application running and then I'll close this part. Let's move into the next topic for today's session, that is MVC. Now MVC is one of the most important topics that you have to understand in Spring Boot, because Spring Boot is completely based on Spring. And Spring is completely based on MVC, that is the Model View Controller. So without any further ado, let's get started with what is MVC or what is Model View Controller. Now Model View Controller is basically a design pattern which is basically used to build applications. Now Spring Framework uses this Model View Controller to basically create applications. It provides features like inversion of control, dependency injection, and so on. So the Spring MVC provides a dignified solution to use MVC in Spring Framework by the help of the dispatcher servlet. Now in this case, the dispatcher servlet is a class that receives the incoming request and maps it to the right resource such as the controllers, models, and views. Right, so I hope that you've understood what MVC stands for. M stands for models, V stands for views, and C stands for controllers. So I hope that part is clear. So now that you know what is Model View Controller in short, let's discuss the four main components of Model View Controller, that is the model, controller, view, and the front controller. So the model basically contains the core data of the application, and data can be either a single object or a group of objects. Coming to controller, this basically contains the business logic of an application and can use the @controller annotation to mark the class as controller. Coming to view, basically the view is used to represent the information in a particular format, and here you can use the JSP plus JSTL to create a view page. And finally, coming to the front controller, in Spring Web MVC, the dispatcher servlet class works as the front-end controller. So I hope that you've understood the different components of the Model View Controller, that is the model, controller, view, and the front controller. So now that you know what the components are, let's take a look at the workflow of the Model View Controller. So as you can see on my screen, all the incoming requests are obstructed by the dispatcher servlet that works as the front-end controller or the front controller. The dispatcher servlet gets an entry of the handler mapping from the XML file and forwards the request to the controller. After that, the controller returns an object of the model and view. So don't worry guys, I'll be talking more about model and view when we get into the hands-on part of it. And now coming back to the workflow, finally the dispatcher servlet checks the entry of the view resolver in the XML file and then invokes the specified view component. So guys, this is the workflow of the Model View Controller. Right, so that was all about the workflow of the Spring MVC or the Spring Model View Controller. So I hope that you've understood what is the Model View Controller. So over here, you basically have to understand, Spring Boot is based on Spring and Spring is based on the Model View Controller, where the model and view object comes into the picture. Now these model and view objects are basically considered to see what resources are coming to the application and what the application has to look like, right? So basically you have a structure, which is the model, and then you have a view. The view is basically how the user sees the application, and the controller basically handles all the actions happening in the application. So I hope that part is clear to you guys. Alright, so that's great. So that was about the Model View Controller, guys. Now let's move forward with the next topic for today's session, that is what is dependency injection.
Take a deep breath and out. Feeling that? That's the sound of your cells breathing well. Yes, with Nat Habit, feel every cell of you come alive. 100% natural, nutrition-powered, fresh ingredients from our Ayurvedic kitchen. Breathe life into millions of your skin and hair cells. Nat Habit. Breathe life into your beauty.
Dependency injection is basically the ability of an object to supply dependencies of another object. Now, I'm pretty sure you might have not understood anything by the technical terms that I just said, right? So let me clear the confusion for you. What do you understand when you hear the term dependency? What comes onto your mind? Obviously, right, that something is relying on something else for a support. Let's say we consider a lame example that, let's say we want to play badminton. Then you need a racket for it, right? So you're completely dependent on the racket to play badminton. So similar is the case in the programming also. Basically, as you can see on my screen, if we have two classes, let's say class A and class B, then what happens is that if we say class A is dependent on class B, then class A uses the methods of class B. So basically, dependency in programming is an approach where a class uses specific functionalities of another class. So as I mentioned before also, if you have two classes A and B, let's say class A uses the functionalities of class B, then it is directly implied that, class A has a dependency on class B. Now, if you're coding in Java, then you must know that, you have to create an instance of class B before the objects are being used by class A. So when class A uses the methods of class B, then please remember that, class A needs to create an instance of class B. Right? So if I have to just define dependency injection for you, then dependency injection is basically a process of creating an object for some other class and let the class directly using the dependency. So this is what, guys, basically dependency injection is known as. So if I have to put it into example again, let's say, there's a class. Now the class asks the dependency injection that, it needs two objects. What the dependency injection does is that, it automatically creates two objects, let's say object A and object B, and then it returns those objects to the class. So that's how dependency injection makes our life easy, right? Now there are mainly three classes involved in dependency injection. That is the client class, the service class, and the injector class. Now talking about the client class first. This class is basically the dependent class and is dependent on the service class. Coming to service class, the service class basically provides a service to the client class. And finally coming to the injector class, well, the injector class is responsible for injecting the service class object into the client class. So we have mainly three classes, that is the client class, the service class, and the injector class. The client class is basically the dependent class. The service class provides a service to the client class. So basically the client class uses the service class and the injector class basically injects the service class object into the client class. So I hope that you have understood what is dependency injection in short and what are the different classes involved in it. So now moving on in this session, let's take a look at the principle on which dependency injection is based on. So the principle on which the dependency injection is based on is the inversion of control. Now, if you ask me what is inversion of control, then I can say that, as the name suggests, inversion of control is basically used to invert different kinds of additional responsibilities of a class rather than the main responsibility itself. So if I have to explain you in simpler terms, then consider an example wherein you have the ability to cook. According to the IOC principle or the inversion of control principle, you can invert the control. So instead of you cooking the food, you can just directly order from outside wherein you receive the food at your doorstep. So basically what's happening over here is that, you had to cook the food, but yes, according to inversion of control, what you did was, you just ordered the food and then you got your food at your doorstep. The process of food delivered to you at your doorstep is basically the inversion of control. Right? So in this way, you do not have to take care of the additional responsibilities and just focus on the main work. So this is basically the concept behind the dependency injection, guys, basically where, a class should not configure its dependencies statically, but it should be configured by some other class from outside. So a class should concentrate on fulfilling its responsibilities like the flow of application and should not concentrate on creating objects. So guys, this was basically the idea behind dependency injection. Now let's take a look at the types of dependency injection. Now there are mainly three types of dependency injection, that is the constructor injection, the setter injection or the property injection, and the interface injection. Talking about the constructor injection first, in this type of injection, the injector supplies the dependency through the client class constructor. Coming to the setter injection or the property injection, in this type of injection, the injector method injects the dependency to the setter method exposed by the client. And finally coming to the interface injection, in this type of injection, the injector uses the interface to provide dependency to the client class, and the clients must implement an interface that will expose a setter method which will accept the dependency. So guys, these were the different types of dependency injection. So I hope till now you've understood that, dependency injection is basically responsible to create objects, understand which classes require those objects, and finally provide those classes with the objects. So on that note, let's take a look at the next topic, that is the benefits of dependency injection. Now, before I list down the benefits of dependency injection, let me explain you the need for this injection on an industry level to help you understand the benefits better. Consider a scenario where you have an email class whose sole responsibility is to take care of the emails received. Now, this class will have objects such as the to email address, the from email address, the subject, and the body of the email. Now, if the company wants to save text and audio messages, do you think this class can save the message? Well, I would say the answer is no. This is because, the email class cannot handle the parameters of the text and the audio messages. So in such cases, you will have to recreate the class, and now recreating the class is quite a cumbersome job, especially if you have to do it regularly, right? And that too on an industry basis. Instead, you can just directly use the dependency injection concept where you have to change the objects at the runtime. In this way, you do not have to recreate the class, which will further help you in a lot of ways on a production level. So if I have to summarize the benefits of dependency injection for you, then I would say it enables an easy way to interact with the components. The applications can be easily extended. It makes unit testing much easier and reduces the boilerplate code. So guys, that was all about dependency injection. I hope you've understood, what was dependency injection, why is it used, where is it used, how do you benefit with dependency injection, and so on. So well, that was about the theory part of dependency injection. Now let's move on to the hands-on part of the dependency injection. So let's get started with the hands-on part. So for that, I'll go back to my Eclipse IDE. And now let's say we create a new project. So for that, I'll go to File, I'll go to New, and then I'll choose Spring Starter Project. Right, and let's say we mention the name to be Dependency Demo. And then our group is com.example and the package is com.example.demo again. And then what I'll do is I'll click on next. Now, once I click on next, what I'll do is I'll basically add the dependency files for it. So let's say I just add the web dependency, right? So I'll just search for web. I'll add in web services, let's say Jersey also. And then you can go forward and add the other dependency files also. But for now, I'll just click on finish over here. So now once I click on finish, you can see on your left hand side that our project is getting created. So until then, I'll just close all these files so that there's no confusion, right? So let's just wait for it to create. Now once the project is created, when I click on this file, you automatically see that we get our application file, which is something like this, that it's a Spring Boot application. And then you have to execute this particular class on executing this particular project. Next, what you have to do is you have to create a class in the same package. And to do that, what you'll do is you have to right click over here, go to new, and then you'll choose class, right? And after that, you'll mention the class name. So let's say, I mentioned the class name to be, let's say, customers, right? So we'll be looking into example where I'll consider customers, and then I'll click on finish. Now, once I click on finish, this is what that you see on your screen. Now let's say, we add few parameters for our customers, let's say customer IDs, customer name, and let's say the course name that he has taken from Edureka, right? So for that, what I'll do is I'll just mention private int, and let's say I mention cust ID, that is basically for customer ID. Similarly, I'll mention private string, and let's say I mention customer name, and private, let's say string again, we mention course name. Now, after this is done, what you have to do is we'll basically add the getter setter methods for these particular properties. So for that, I'll just select these particular properties, right click over here, go to source, and then I'll choose generate getter and setter methods, right? So I'll just basically select all and click on generate. Right now, once I click on generate, you see that automatically our getter setter methods have got generated for these particular parameters, right? So I'll just copy the customer name and the course name from over here. And then I'll paste it over here so that there's no confusion. Now, let's say, you have a scenario where you have to create an object for customers and you do not want to do it manually. Now, in such a scenario, you will have to use the dependency injection to get the objects whenever you require it. So that's what we were talking in theory part, where you do not want to create objects manually, but you want to get it at the runtime, or maybe you want to recreate them, right? So this is where basically dependency injection comes into the picture, where you want to get the objects whenever there's a requirement. So now let's see how we can achieve that with the help of dependency injection. So what I'll do is I'll first go back to my application file, and then what I'll do is I'll basically change the run line in the application class file, right? So over here, if you see, we have spring application.run, and then we have the application class name and the arguments, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to basically change it to configurable context. right? So over here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make it is equal to, and then on the left hand side, I'll mention configurable application context. Let's say we mention context. And then if it shows an error, you basically have to import the required library. So let's just wait for that to come. Right, so I'll just basically import this particular library, that is import context.configurable application context. Now what this line of code will basically do is that, it will return an object at the time of execution. So that's what we wanted, right? We wanted to create an object, or maybe we wanted to return an object at the runtime execution. So that's what this particular line is going to do. Now what you have to do is you have to basically add the line customers C is equal to context.getBean, right? So that is what, and then we'll mention the class name, that is customers.class, right? And then you clearly see that, we're getting errors. Let's see what's the error for. All right, so I missed a semicolon over here, right? And then my C should be capital because my customer's class name is capital. And also my C should be capital over here, right? So that's what resolves our error. So basically over here, with the help of this particular line, we're trying to tell the compiler to return an object of the customer's class, right? So after that, what you have to do is you have to check whether it is working or not. So to do that, we can go back to our customer's class, and then what we can do is we can just add the public void display method, right? So what I'll do is I'll just add a method, let's say public, and let's put it in lowercase, and I'll mention public void display, just a single bracket. And then in brackets, I'll mention system.out.println, and in brackets, I'll mention the text, let's say object returned successfully, right? And then I'll just end it with a semicolon, and let's say I make it more clear, that is customers object returned successfully, right? Now, basically this particular method, that is a display method, will return an output that, customer's object returns successfully if our code runs fine. Next, what you have to do is you have to go back to the application file again, and then you have to basically mention the method's name over here, that is c.display that we had just created, right? So over here, you're basically calling the object of the customer's class with the reference of the display method. So that's how basically you can use. Now let's execute the project and see what happens. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run this particular project. So I'll just right click over here, go to run as, and choose Spring Boot app, right? So I'll just click on OK, and let me just drag this particular output console. All right, there's an error to start, and that is because, Tomcat connector has failed to start on port 8080. The port is already in use, right? So for that, let's say, we again change the port number. So I'll go back to my resources file, and I'll mention server.port equal to, let's say 8082, right? And then I'll again execute this particular code. So I'll right click over here, go to run as, and choose Spring Boot app. Now when you execute this particular project, we see an error of no qualifying bean of type com.example.demo.customers is available. Now this is basically because, the customer class which you have defined is not a Spring bean, that is, it is not a Spring object. So to tell the Spring container that, we need an object of the customer class, we need to mention the @component annotation in the customer's class, right? So we'll go back to our customer's class, and then what I'll do is I'll scroll up, and over here I'll mention @component, and I'll import the required libraries for that. Now, once you mention the @component annotation, what happens is that when you mention C equal to context.getBean customers class that you had mentioned in the application class, the compiler will check whether there is a customer bean available in the container or not. If the bean is available, then the Spring framework is basically injecting the customer object in your application. So basically, this object is created by the Spring framework, which can be used further in the application. So now let's just execute the project again. So for that, I'll close this particular project, and let's say I choose the relaunch option, and then I click on OK. Right? So let's see what happens once the project gets executed. Now, once the project gets executed, you see an output of, customer's object returned successfully. Right? So that is basically how we can implement the dependency injection, guys. We wanted an object to be created, and we did not want to do it manually. Instead, we chose to do it at runtime, right? So basically, it automatically happened at the runtime. So to do that, what I'd done is that, I'd basically created a customers class with the parameters like customer ID, customer name, and course name. And for that, I'd put in the getter setter methods. And finally, I went back to the application class where I'd basically changed the configurable application context run line to this particular line that you can see on my screen. And then I set customers C equal to context.getBean customers.class. So basically over here, we're trying to tell the Spring container that, we need a Spring object of the customers class. So that is the reason we've mentioned customers over here. And then to just check the output, I'd created a method with the name display. And then if the project runs fine, we had seen that, we get an output of customers object returned successfully, right? So for that, I just call this particular method in this particular class. Apart from that, I just chose the server port to be 8082. So that's how basically, guys, you can implement the dependency injection, right? So I hope that you've understood how dependency injection works in Spring Boot. Now let's extend this example and further see how a class dependent on the other class uses the functionalities of that particular class in Spring Boot. So that was about dependency injection, right? So our main concept of dependency injection was how a specific class which is dependent on the other class uses its functionality, right? So let's see how that happens. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to extend the same project. So for that, I'll just stop the execution over here. And then what I'll do is I'll create a new class. So to do that, again, I'll right click on the package over here, go to new, and then I'll say class. And let's say, I'd mentioned the class name to be technologies, right? So we just working with the different technologies and the courses, right? So I'll just mention technologies and then I'll click on finish, right? So similarly as that of the customer class, I'll add few parameters in the technology class like the tech ID and the tech name, right? So I'll mention private int and then I'll mention tech ID, right? And then again, I'll mention private string and then I'll mention tech name. So now once this is done, I'll again generate the getter setter method. So I'll choose these particular parameters, right click over here, go to source, and then I'll choose generate getter and setters, right? So I'll select over here and click on generate. Now after that, you'll see that, automatically the getter and the setter methods have got generated. Now once that is done, we'll again basically use a method to display the output, whether it is successful or not. So I'll again just mention public void, let's say tech, and in brackets, I'll mention system.out.println, and in brackets, I'll mention, let's say, completed. And then I'll just close this particular section. And now what I'll do is I'll basically call this tech method in the customers class, right? So I'll go back to the customers class. And then what I'll do is I'll basically add a new parameter over here that is private, the class name that is basically technologies, and then I'll mention, let's say, tech detail, right? So that is basically the parameter that I'm using over here. And then I'll select this particular parameter, right click, go to source, and I'll generate the getter and the setter methods for it, right? So I'll just select this and click on generate, right? So let me just put it before this so that it's clear. Now after that, what we'll do is we'll basically use the tech method to mention the tech details.tech under the display method of the customers class, right? So to make sure that the tech detail option is instantiated, you have to go back to the technologies class, and over here you basically have to mention the @component annotation, right? So I'll just mention @component, right? And then I'll import this particular section, and in the display class of customers, what I'll basically do is I'll call in the tech method. So for that, I'll mention tech detail that I had just chosen as a parameter in the customers class, and then I'll mention the tech method. So that looks fine. Now let's just execute this particular project again. So I'll just relaunch this particular project. All right, so we see an error that, Java lang null pointer exception, but, our dependency application has started, but yet it says that, customers object returned successfully, but does not shows the completed method, right? So that is basically the completed output that we wanted to see. Doesn't show that. That's because, the customer class is dependent on the technologies class, but yet it does not know the existence of the technologies class, right? So if you say you have class A and class B, then class A is dependent on class B, but yet it does not know the existence of class B. So to make sure that, the class A gets to know about the existence of class B, you have to use the Autowired annotation. So basically the Autowired annotation is used to enable a class to recognize the other class and make sure the dependencies are satisfied. So let's see how to make sure that, the customer class recognizes the technologies class. So to do that, you basically have to insert the @Autowired annotation in the customers class itself, right? So what I'll do is I'll just drag this down, and then what I'll do is before the technologies details section, I'll just add @Autowired, right? And then I'll just import the required libraries for that. And then what I'll do is I'll again execute the project. So let's just relaunch the project again. And let's say I just drag this up so that we can see the output. So once the project gets executed, we clearly see an output of, customers object returned successfully and also completed, which means our dependency has been satisfied by both the classes, and both the classes know the existence of each other, and the customers class is using the object of the technologies class. So guys, that's how you can use dependency injection in Spring Boot. I hope that you've understood how to get started with it. So guys, that was all about dependency injection. Now let's move forward with the next section for today's session, that is how to create a web application using Spring Boot. Now all of us work with web applications on a day-to-day basis. But how do we start creating it? So let's take a look at how do we start creating the web application using Spring Boot. Now to create a web application using Spring Boot, you have to follow a few steps. Now the steps are basically what would be the controller, what you would request on URL, and what should be returned. So these are the main 3 questions that have to be answered. That is, what is your request URL, what has to be returned, and what is the controller. So let's get started and see how we can create a web application, right? So for that, I'll shift back to my Eclipse IDE, and then I've closed all the files so that there's no further confusion, right? And now what I'll do is I'll go to file over here, go to new, and let's say I create a new project, right? In the new project, let's say I'll mention the name to be web app, right? So I'll just mention courses web apps. Let's work on courses. And again, we have to check our group ID, artifact ID, version, and so on. So here, I'm not going to change the description and all. And then I'll just click on next. Once I click on next, this is one of the most important things that you have to consider in a web application. Since we're making a web application, we basically need the web dependency, right? So I'll just search for web dependency. And then you see that, we have the Spring Web, the reactive web, and the web services, right? So what I'll do is I'll just click over here. I'll choose the Spring Web. I'll choose the Spring Web services. We can also choose Jersey. Well, it's completely your call what dependencies that you want. Well, for this particular application, we need the Spring Web. But for your understanding, I'm using the Spring Web services and Jersey also, but just in case. And after that, I'll click on finish. Now, once I click on finish, you'll see that, the project is getting created. So let's just wait for that to happen. All right, so as you can see, my project has been created, and then we have a main folder in which the package name is demo, and then we have the main application file folder, that is the courses web application. Now what I'm going to do in this particular application is that I'm going to create a web application using the JSP files. Nowadays, I would say that, not everybody is using JSP files, and most of us are using the REST APIs and the REST methods and other files. But I would say to make you understand a simple application, JSP is the best thing that we can use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a JSP file first. So before I do that, if you see on my left hand side, I have a source folder, and then inside that I have a main folder. So over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder, and inside that particular folder, I'm going to put the JSP file, right? So I'll just right click over here, go to new. Let's say I choose folder, and let's say I mention the folder name to be web app, right? And then I'll click on finish. And inside this particular folder, I'll go to new again, and then I'll choose file. And in these files, what I'll do is I'll basically search for the JSP files, right? So I'm not going to search presently. What I'll just mention is I'll mention courses.jsp, and then I'll click on finish. Once I click on courses.jsp, you see that, automatically the JSP file gets created. But yes, we do not see few files. So let's just right click over here, go to new, and then let's create the file again. Right, so I'll just search for JSP over here. Okay, so we have the JSP over here. I'll click on next, and then let's say we mentioned the file name to be courses, and okay, it says courses exists, so I'll just mention it to be course, and then I'll click on finish. Right, so once I click on finish, you see that automatically the JSP file has been created. So what I'll do is I'll just delete this part so that there's no confusion further, and then we have this particular file, that is course.jsp. Now, once the course.jsp file has been created, this is basically our view. So if you remember in the theory part, I was talking about the model view controller. So our JSP file is basically the view, that is basically what the user sees. The model is basically how we are building the model, and the controller is where we decide what request has to be sent and what will be the response that the user sees. So basically what happens is that, the request goes to the controller, and then the controller calls this particular file, that is the courses.jsp file. So now if you observe in our project, we do not have a controller. Now, if you're not working on Spring Boot, and maybe if you were working on any other technologies, then creating a controller takes quite amount of time. But when it comes to Spring Boot, you can just directly create the controller by just creating a new class. So for that, I'll go to the package, and then I'll right click over there, and then I'll choose class, right? And over here, let's say I mentioned the class name to be courses controller, right? Well, the class name actually doesn't matter. You can mention whatever that you want to mention, and then I'll just click on finish. Now, once I click on finish, we basically need a method to display the output. So to do that, I'll just create a method, let's say public void, and let's say courses. And inside that, let's say I mention system.out.println, and inside that, I'll mention welcome to Edureka, right? So what we basically are doing is that, we're just creating a method just to display the output. So basically, whenever the controller accepts the request and the request is taken forward, we want to display an output that, welcome to Edureka. The only problem over here is that, still this is just a class. It's not a controller, right? So the Spring Boot doesn't identify this particular class as a controller unless you use the @controller annotation. So to do that, you basically have to type in @controller. Right, and then you have to just import the required library. Now, once you've put the @controller annotation, Spring Boot automatically identifies this particular class as the controller class. Now, the problem over here is that, we do not know what the request is, and we have not passed any request. So we just know what the output will be, that is welcome to Edureka. We've created a JSP page, and then we've not configured anything in that till now. But we have to configure the request, right? So to configure the request, basically what we'll do is we'll use the @request mapping annotation, and then we'll just mention /courses, right? So whenever we see this request of /courses on our local host, we see that, automatically this particular output has to be printed, that is welcome to Edureka. Now, to run any web application, what happens is that, you need a server. So basically what happens is that in Spring Boot, we have an embedded Tomcat server. So you do not have to configure it separately. You have an embedded Tomcat server which is present. So if you want to check, you can just go to the Maven dependencies, and then you see Tomcat embedded code, Tomcat embedded WebSocket, and so on. So basically all our servers have been configured automatically, right? So when you start the application, right? So whenever you wish to start the application, you'll see an output that, Tomcat started on port number, whatever you configure, right? So what I'll do is I'll basically you configure the port first, so that, we move forward and see what happens when we execute the application, right? So I'll go to the main resources file. I'll go to application properties. I'll mention server.port. Let's say I go to a different port, let's say 8083, right? I'll click on save. And then what I'll do is I'll just execute this particular application. I'll right click over here, go to run as, and choose Spring Boot app, right? I'll click on OK. And then once I click on OK, you see that, automatically our execution has started, right? So let's just wait for the execution to be finished. And once we see the execution is done, we see that, Tomcat started on port number 8083. That means our server has started and the application has started. So what I'll do is I'll go to the port 8083 / and I'll mention courses. All right, now we see an error over here. Why do you think the error might have come? That is because, we haven't mapped the JSP file to be returned when we use this particular URL. So whenever a client sends this particular request, that is localhost :8083 /courses, we wanted the courses JSP file to be returned, right? But, there was no mapping that had happened for that. So for that, what we'll do is we'll go back to our file, right? And then I'll go back to my courses controller, right? And over here, I'll mention return, and I'll mention course.jsp. That is basically our file name. All right, so as we can see, there's an error that, we cannot return when the method is void, right? So I'll just change it to string, right? And then you see that, the error goes, right? Now, let's say, we execute the project, right? So I'll just relaunch this particular project. So I'll right click over here, go to run as, and then I'll choose Spring Boot app, right? And then I'll click on OK, and let's see what happens. All right, it says that, Tomcat has started on port number 8083 and the application has started. So let's just open our localhost colon 8083. Right, we see that there's nothing happening on the localhost side, and then we see there was an unexpected error, type not found 404 status. So that is because Spring Boot still doesn't know that how to convert a JSP file to a servlet. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop executing this particular application, and then what I'll do is I'll go to the pom.xml file, and then I'll have to include the Jasper dependency. So let me just open the pom.xml file. Right, I'll just drag this down. I'll go to the official website, let's say Maven repository, and then I'll search for Jasper. Right, and then I'll just click over here, and then you see a lot of versions of it, right? So we do not know which version has to be used. So for that, what we'll do is we'll go to the Maven dependencies, and then we see that the Tomcat embedded is of 9.0.24. So we'll go for the same one. Right, so we'll go for 9.0.24. So I'll just select over here, and then I'll just copy this particular section of the code. Right, I'll go back to my Eclipse file, and then I'll just paste it over here. Right, now once this is done, you're basically showing the Spring Boot how to convert a JSP file to a servlet. Now what we're going to do is let's just relaunch this particular application, and let's just drag this. So once I drag, we see that the Tomcat has started on port number 8083 again. So I'll just say courses, and then once I execute, you see that it's a blank page. That's because we haven't configured the JSP file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over here. I'm going to stop the execution, right? And then I'll go to the JSP file. I'm going to drag this down, and let's say I mention top selling courses are, and then I mention DevOps, Python, Big Data, AWS, and RPA. Right, so we can do like let's put 1 2 3 4 5. Right, and then over here in the insert title, I'll just mention Edureka courses. I'll just save this file, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to execute this file again. So I'll just relaunch this application, and then once I relaunch this application, let's just wait for the output. So as soon as I relaunch this application, you see Tomcat has started. So I'll just refresh this particular page, and we see that top selling courses are DevOps, Python, Big Data, AWS, and RPA, and the title has also changed, right? So that means our course.jsp file has been returned. Now if you observe over here, if I just remove this particular section, and then if I put @response body, so if I just put in this @response body annotation, let's see what happens. I'll just import the required libraries for this. My bad, I put it in a wrong place. What we have to do is we have to mention it after request mapping, right? So I'll just mention it over here, and then I'll import the required libraries, right? And let's see what happens, right? So I'll just relaunch this particular application again. All right, now once I've relaunched this application, let's just refresh this particular page, and then you see that course.jsp. Well, this was a JSP file's name, right? So what basically happens with response body is that whatever you're going to see over here is basically the data, and it is not going to return a web page, right? So whenever you want to return a specific data, then you use the response body annotation. Else you do not use the response body annotation, and then if you want to just return a web page, then you just use the request mapping annotation to just map the URL and then send back. Well guys, this was how you can create a web application. Well, this was a really simple web application that I had created. I just created a simple JSP file in which I'd mentioned the body to be a specific set of lines. And then what I did was, I created a controller. So in the controller, I sent a request mapping /courses. And then I said, whenever this particular URL is sent, we have to return the course.jsp file. So the course.jsp file is basically a view, and the controller is a controller, and the model is basically how you put in the structure of the project. So guys, that's how you can basically create a simple web application. Now, before I close this section, let's say, you do not want to mention course.jsp, but you just want to mention course, right? So that's where the application properties file comes into the picture. I'm just going to kill this process, and then I'll just close over here. And then what I'll do is I'll change it to course. And then in the application properties file, what you have to mention is basically spring.mvc.view, and then in the prefix you have to mention the folder name. That was basically our web app folder. So if you see, I have the web app folder which has the web pages, right? That is all the JSP files, right? So I'll just mention prefix / and I'll mention web app. Now, after that, basically, I want to identify the course.jsp file, right? So I have to again mention the suffix also. So similarly, what I'll do is I'll just copy this particular part. I'll just paste it over here, and then I'll mention suffix equal to, and then I'll mention JSP, right? So this will be in dot because the file name is filename.jsp, right? So that's because, that's the reason. So the prefix will be /webapp, that is basically the folder name, and the suffix will be .jsp. Now I'll just save this particular file. I'll relaunch this application, and then let's see what happens. All right, so we can see that, the Tomcat has started. So let's go back to our local host. All right, it says that, localhost 8083, there's no mapping to it. All right, so my bad, you have to put another slash at the end also. That's because, it's a directory, right? So you have to say A/B/C because, it's a set of folders. That is inside source, there was main, inside main, there's web app, and inside web app, we have course.jsp, right? So you need a slash at the end also. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to relaunch this application again. And let's see again if we get the output or not. So I'll just click on OK. All right, so once I click on OK, you can see that, Tomcat has started. So I'll just refresh this particular page. And again, we see that, the application has no explicit mapping, right? So what I'm going to do is I'll just check what's going wrong. So let me just go back to the controller, right? And in the controller, what I'll do is I'll just change it to courses over here. Or let's say I change it to course. That doesn't matter so. And then I'll again relaunch the application. Let's see what's the issue. Let's see if we execute. Okay, there's an error still. So I think the error is with the folder. So let's just create a new folder over here. Let's say I mention it to be web pages, right? And inside that, I'm going to put the course.jsp file, right? And in the application properties, what I'll do is I'll just change it to web pages, right? I'll just save, and then my bad, it was course, right? I'll just relaunch this particular application. You see that, Tomcat has started on port 8083 and then on course. Let's just refresh. All right, once I refresh, you see that, we get the output as top selling courses are DevOps, Python, Big Data, AWS, and RPA, right? So the main problem over here that was I hadn't created a folder name that was web pages. So basically we are trying to put the JSP file inside the folder, right? So that's what we have to do. So I had directly taken the web app folder, but that's not the way to do. You have to create another folder in which you'll put the JSP files, and also in the controller file, you have to remove the .jsp suffix for the file, and then you have to mention in the request mapping to be /course, or in fact you go back to your courses, right? So it's not a big deal. It's completely based on your text that you want to mention. So I hope this part is clear. So with this, guys, I wrap up this particular part of the session. Now let's say, you want to create a web application to pass the client's data, right? So obviously it's not always that, we have specific data that is already predefined, right? Sometimes it may also happen that, we want to pass the client data into an application, right? So let's see how to do that. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to extend this particular project that we have just created. That is the courses project. But before that, let me just close everything so that there's no confusion again, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to close the pom.xml file. And then we have the web application, the course.jsp, the course controller, and the application properties. Now, what was happening till now was that, we sent a URL /courses, and wherever /courses had been sent, we return a JSP file that is course.jsp, right? Now, in the course.jsp, I had mentioned this particular data. Now, what we want to do is basically we want to pass the client's data. For example, let's say, I want to mention my name, Sahiti. So if I want to mention my name, so in URLs, how you mention your name is basically, you have a URL, let's say localhost :8083/courses. And then what happens is you mention question mark, and then you mention name equal to Sahiti, right? Now, once this particular name has been mentioned over here, what we want to do is we want to make sure that, we get the name over here that is in the JSP file. So how do you think that we can do that? Well, that is really simple. We just have to use the servlet request option. That is basically the HTTP servlet request dispatcher, right? So what I'm going to do is in the JSP file, initially, I'm just going to mention welcome to Edureka. And then what I'm going to do is in the course controller file, what I'm going to mention over here is basically that, public string courses. And over here, I'll mention HTTP servlet request, right? And then I'll mention an object, let's say REQ. Now, what I'm basically doing is that, when I mention this name Sahiti over here, we are passing the name to the server, but nothing's happening on the server side, right? So basically we have no method to basically accept the request from the client and then process the request. Well, to do that, we have to configure the controller, and that's the reason I've mentioned the servlet request over here. As soon as to pass the data in the URL, automatically that particular data has been fetched from over here, and then the required actions are taken into account. So what I've done is I've mentioned HTTP servlet request REQ, and then I'll just import the required package. And over here, what I'm trying to do is that, I'm telling the Spring to automatically connect the request to the right object. And when we have the right object, we just have to fetch it, right? So that's what we're trying to do over here. So that's what I'm doing. I'm just mentioning HTTP servlet request. And then what I'll do is I'll just fetch this particular request. So I'll just mention string, let's say course name equal to, and then I'll mention request.get parameter, right? And over here again I'll mention, let's say course name. I'm sorry, let's put it in small letters. That is course name, right? So the course name sounds a big name for URL, so I'll just mention CNAME, right? And over here also I'll just mention CNAME, right? And then what I'm gonna do is I'll just close. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to close the bracket. All right. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to relaunch this particular application, right? So let's just relaunch this particular application and let's see what happens. Once I relaunch this application, let's just say we mention the course name to be DevOps, and then I'll click on enter. Now, once I click on enter, we see that, we get redirected to our JSP page that is welcome to Edureka. But what we wanted was basically a course name to be displayed also, right? So to do that, what we're going to do is I'm going to go back to my Eclipse IDE over here. And then what I'll do is I'll mention system.out.println, and brackets I'll mention the course name is, let's say colon, and then we'll use the object that we just created, that was CNAME. Oh, I'm sorry, the spelling is wrong. Right, and then I'll just save this particular file. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to relaunch this particular application, right? So let's just relaunch. Right, after relaunching, if we refresh this particular application, you see that there's no change in the output. That was because we haven't configured the JSP file to accept the object, right? So we have configured the controller to fetch the object, but yes, the object doesn't store the data that the client is still passing, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the HTTP session request. So what I'm going to do is I'll just put an enter over here and I'll type in HTTP, let's say session. Let's give the name session equal to request.get session. And then I'll just close this particular bracket and then I'll import the HTTP session, right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the session object, right? So I'll just use session.set attribute. And in the name, I'll mention CNAME, right? And value also, I'll mention CNAME, right? So let's just mention that. And the name should be in string, guys. So I'll mention in double quotes, right? And then what I'll do is I'll go back to my JSP file. And over here, I'll just mention welcome to Edureka. And then what I'll do is I'll just put // so that there's space. And then we'll just mention $. And in flower brackets, we'll mention CNAME, right? So that means that, automatically our course name will be printed over here. Now, after that is done, what I'll do is I'll just basically relaunch our application, right? So I'll just save this file and let's just relaunch the application. All right, so as you can see, Tomcat has started. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go over here and then I'll refresh this particular page. And when I refresh this particular page, you can see that, we passed the course name to be DevOps and then DevOps got printed over here. For example, let's say I mention RPA. So automatically it will change to RPA. So that's how, guys, basically you can pass the client data to a web application. Now, if you observe over here, we hadn't got this output of, system.out.println where the course name is CNAME, right? So that was because, we've already used the session object where, the session object sets the attribute for the CNAME that is taken from the URL. And then it is returned to the JSP file, which finally shows the output to the user. So I don't think this is necessary. Also, you can just remove this part and you can just comment out and try to execute again, right? So that's how, guys, basically you can pass the client's data to a web application. I hope you've understood how to create a web application and also how to pass a client's data to a web application. So now that you know how to pass a client's data in web application, let's move forward with the session and understand an example on the model view and object. Now, if you remember in the theory part, I was talking about the model view controller, right? So basically where we have a model view and a controller and how these three components collaborate with each other. So let's look into the same on the practical side of how you can use a model view and object. But before that, let me just switch back to my Eclipse workspace. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop this process. And now before I move forward, I hope you've understood that we're fetching a name from the client and then we're adding it to a session and then we're displaying the output on the JSP file, right? But let's say, we want to accept the course name without using the HTTP session or, without using the HTTP servlet request. Do you think that can happen? Well, I would say it could definitely happen. So to do that, what you can basically do is that, you can basically remove this part, right? And then what you can just do is you just have to mention string name, right? So whatever data that we are getting from the client, we're basically storing in this particular variable, that is the string name, or you can just say the course name. Right. So over here, I'm just getting all the data, that is basically all the client data, and I'm storing it in this particular variable. Now, since we're not using the REQ object, so what we're going to do is I'm just going to remove this particular part and also this particular part where I'm getting the parameter. Now, the reason is basically we're already getting data from the client side in this particular method, that is basically the string CNAME. But yet we have to get the session data, right? So that is basically since it's in our URL. So we still have to use HTTP session over here, and then we'll mention session. And then what you can do is you can just save this file and then reload this particular application, right? So now once you reload this particular application, let's see what the output comes as, right? So I'll just reload this particular application and then you see an output that, welcome to Edureka RPA. Now you see that, there's no change in the URL, there's no change in the output, and there's no change at all, right? That's because, we are again doing the same thing, but the only difference is that, we're not using the HTTP request servlet, request body, and the response body. But yet we are using a string CNAME, basically where all the client data is getting stored in this particular CNAME from the session data. Now let's say, you change the course's CNAME to, let's say, CNAMEs, right? Do you think it's going to work? Well, I would say no, it's not going to work. It's just going to print welcome to